So I was just playing my game, testing it out. It's pretty cool and all, but I thought to myself, what would make this really cool? So I was staring at the game, thinking for a while, and then I did what only the best of developers do when stuck. I restarted my game. So let me just start off by saying I didn't delete my game, I only restarted it. And the big difference between the two is I knew exactly what systems I would need, so this process would be fairly quick. I started off pretty simple, just getting the basic systems in for what I needed. And first up, weapons. So I quickly set up a JSON and a bunch of stats to mess with for every weapon. These included damage, cooldown, knockback, and a bunch of other stuff. And with this setup, all I had to do was pull these stats over to the weapon whenever the player picked it. This made it quite easy to implement new weapons, and I started off by getting the first 8 weapons in. Now for these weapons, I wanted each to feel unique, so they would each have a specific build that would be ideal for the player to go for during the run. Now you may be asking, why do this? And let me quickly show you exactly why this is important, as many other roguelikes have the same exact systems. So in Nuclear Throne, there's characters for the player to choose from, and each of these characters has its own playstyle that the player may find ideal, and each of them feel unique from each other. In Enter the Gungeon, this character system is also present, and each has a differing skill set to fit the player's own playstyle. Now with my game, I wanted to stay away from this character system, so I went with each weapon having an identity instead. To show this, here's the first weapon I implemented, the Amethyst Staff. So in the old version of the game, this Amethyst Staff was supposed to be the simple weapon, almost like a pistol in a first-person shooter. But this new version was much more interesting. I wanted to stay away from boring weapons, instead making each of them feel powerful right off the start. So this Amethyst Staff shoots many projectiles out, with each having a slight homing effect towards enemies. Now the interesting thing I added is that while other weapons can have their accuracy improved during the run, this staff can't. Instead, upgrading the accuracy of the weapon will have it begin to shoot more projectiles out. This effect will act as the build for the player, where they can hyper focus on upgrading accuracy and then feel the effects happen to their weapon. The next staff I added was the Spear of Zeus. This weapon will fire 3 times, each having a 3-round burst. After these 3 attacks, the player will then throw the spear out, doing huge damage to each enemy hit. This spear also has piercing. Now this 3 attack and then throw cycle can be improved greatly through upgrading attack speed, as throwing the spear causes a really large cooldown to begin. I then added 6 more weapons, so I had a base of 8 different weapons to start out with, and I made sure each felt great to use while being unique from the others. Now while showing off both of these weapons, I mentioned upgrading, which in my game will take form in gems. Now each weapon or ability is broken down into 8 elements, and so for these gems, I also went with 8 different elements. During the run, these gems may show up, and the player can infuse them into a weapon or ability during the run. Infusing a gem into the weapon has differing effects based on what gem it is, such as the air gem increasing the knockback of the weapon, or the poison gem increasing the lifesteal. But there's 2 gems in particular, the amethyst and the void gem, that are quite different from the others. While the other 6 gems only modify stats, both of these gems will alter your weapon entirely, adding a new effect or changing exactly how the weapon functions. I can actually show this quite easily with the amethyst staff. So here I have the amethyst staff, and you see it's just shooting normal bullets. But then I see an amethyst gem show up. If I take this amethyst gem and infuse it into the weapon, it will then add an effect to the weapon, where when the projectiles are destroyed, 3 or more projectiles will burst out of it. Going on the other side of it, if I infuse the void gem into it, it adds a small explosion to the projectiles. And while this effect is also cool, with this system, both of the gems can be infused separately, so the player can actually have both effects at the same time. But this is also a tough decision to make. I made it so each weapon can only have 3 gem slots, and the player will have to choose exactly which they want to build their weapon. Now during a run, they will always have an amethyst or a void gem show up. They may have other gems show up, so they're gonna have to pick and choose exactly which ones they want and what stats they want to buff. Now they may have an amethyst gem show up early on in the run to add the burst effect, but later on 2 water gems show up and they can increase their weapon's attack speed. This will make it so the player can build out their weapon exactly how they want, and make one run with an amethyst staff feel entirely differently from the next run with an amethyst staff. This system of 3 gem slots, combined with having 8 different gems that you can infuse, will allow for numerous builds for each weapon. And then I took the system even further, where I added a trade-off. So when a gem shows up, it has a chance to have a debuff. This can create a trade-off for the player, where they may choose to take a gem to increase one stat, but at the cost of another. One example of this is if a water gem shows up with no debuff, and it has a flat percentage attack speed boost for the weapon that you infuse it into. Now if the same water gem spawned with a debuff, it may give this attack speed boost, but at the cost of another stat, such as knockback or lifesteal. This just adds another layer of decision making for the player, where they have many different options to choose from, but they have to ultimately decide on one infusion to go with. Now setting up these 2 systems was quite smooth, as I had an idea of what exactly I needed to create going off of the old project. Now the next system I had to add back in was the enemies. So I set up these enemies with the same JSON format as the weapon, allowing me to quickly modify the enemy stats to scale them along with the arenas. As the player goes through their run, the health and damage of the enemies will also increase. This will make it so the desert zone, if it shows up at the beginning, will be a lot easier than if the desert zone shows up at the end. Now I used this system to add in the same enemies as I had before, getting in the mag maggot, the wooden knight, the wooden shaman, the boulder, and the mushroom, all pretty easily. I also expanded this system past what the old system did, allowing me to add bullet patterns. I used this to change up what the wooden shaman did. With the old version of this enemy, he would just put up a shield, and if the player hit this shield, it would reflect the bullet back at the player. This new version will instead go towards other enemies, and then try to heal them. Along with healing enemies, I can also change the bullets so they have homing, or they're explosive. This will just allow me to make a lot more unique enemies in the future. And the way I had this system set up made it a lot easier to implement the boss this time around. I gave the boss the same charge that I had before, and then I used the new system that I had to create 2 different attacks. In one of them, he'll stop moving and then shoot out in 6 directions around him. In the other one, he'll dash around and between each dash shoot towards the player. I also made it so the boss won't repeat attacks. And then I wanted to make sure that there was more projectiles going around during the boss fight, just to make it more tense. During all 3 of these attacks, he'll throw buckets off of his head. These buckets will act as bombs, which will then explode to release more projectiles out. This boss fight already felt a lot better than the old one. And the way I had this system set up made the bullet patterns a lot easier to implement. Now there was one last system I had to get back in the game, the abilities. The way the abilities work is very similar to the weapons, where I have the same stats that can be modified during the run. This allowed us so the infusion system also worked with the weapons. All of these gems can be infused to upgrade both the abilities or the weapons, so the player has even more choices during a run. I also wanted to get the base of the game down, so I added 8 abilities to start. I was able to use the same bullet pattern system as the enemies before these abilities instead. Here's the tidal wave ability, which knocks the enemies away from the player. And here's a unique ability called Spark, where the player will send forward a small spark, which after a second and a half will call down a lightning strike. These abilities are supposed to be way more powerful than the weapon, but with a way longer cooldown. Because of this, and the way that the infusion system works, some gems may be better to put on the weapon, while others may be better to put on the ability. But the player will just have to make that decision during their run. And now with all of these different systems in place, what's next? Oh yeah, the ice zone. So now that I started working on the ice zone, I was able to make sure the enemies were a lot more unique than the old version. I have the 5 different enemies planned out, as well as the boss, which will go with the general theme of the zone, being a mechanized tundra. This boss is a giant mothership, and here's a little sneak peek of it. If you want to see exactly how I transform this area, make sure to subscribe. And if you want to talk to me about the game, join my Discord. The link is in the description. In that Discord, I'm also going to be showing some sneak peeks of development. And those that were already in the Discord actually knew about my other game that I released onto Steam called Gemstones, which you can actually go over and try out on Steam right now. So make sure you go join us so you don't miss out on these updates. And another way to not miss out on these updates is by subscribing. And if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like it. See ya.